It would be great if we could track our progress through the course and see which lessons we've completed and how far along we've come. For now, we'll just put a checkbox on this lesson page, but later on in this course, we're going to look at how we can integrate this with a backend that will connect to a database, and in that way we can persist that state and we can see how our students are doing. To get started, we'll add in a lesson complete button, which I'll paste in here. Then we'll add this lesson complete button to our lesson page. Great, we can see that our button is now rendering to the page. But unfortunately, when we click it, nothing happens. We need to create a ref to actually track the state of this button. Now we can mark the lessons as complete. But we have a few issues here. When we go between different lessons, we see that we lose our state. This is because when we go to a new lesson, the lesson page is destroyed and recreated. This destroys the ref that we have tracking the state and then recreates it again. Another problem is that we're storing our state as a single variable. We end up with a collection of different variables, one for each lesson. This makes it really difficult for us to calculate the progress or save it in a database in a nice and clean way. It would be much better if we could store them all into one single variable. Instead, we can store all of these progress variables inside of an array. If we have an array for the entire course, then an array for each chapter, and then each Boolean variable within that represents whether the lesson is completed or not. This array is much easier to store in a database and also much easier to do computations on to track how far we've come in a specific chapter and also how far we've come in the overall course. We'll store this variable using the useState composable that's provided by Nuxt. You can see here that useState returns a ref to us, but unlike the ref function built into Vue, it works better in two important ways. Number one, we can share this state between different components so that each lesson can share the same progress state that doesn't get destroyed when we switch between lessons. And we're able to do this in a simpler way that doesn't require us to use Pina or Vuex or any other state management library that you may like. Number two, useState handles server-side data better than ref does. Right now, we're not really concerned about server-side state since we're only dealing with the client side. So we'll cover this more in a later lesson. So we'll switch over to using the useState composable. We need to give it a unique key so that it knows which piece of state we're trying to grab. And then also a function that will return the default value in case this value has not been initialized yet. Next, we'll use a computed value to grab the state that we're looking for from our progress state. Here we have a couple of guards before we actually grab the correct value. Because we're initializing our progress value to an empty array, we first need to check if there's an array for the chapter. If that chapter does not exist, then we know we haven't completed the lesson, so we return false. Then we check to see if the lesson exists. If not, we know we haven't completed the lesson, so we return false. And lastly, we know that the value exists, so we simply return the value. Next, we need a way of updating this progress state. Here we have a similar guard. First, we check to see if that chapter exists, and if the chapter array does not, we create it. And then, once we've made sure that the chapter array exists, we set the value, toggling it so that we can flip between true and false. The last thing to do to make this all work is to update how we're setting the value and updating it on our lesson complete button. Because we have a more complicated way of retrieving the value and then updating it, we can no longer use vModel. Now when we go over to our app and we toggle this button, we'll see that it holds its state when we go between different lessons. If we open up the DevTools, we can also see how this is working in the progress state. Here we have our array of arrays to track our progress. Since we've only clicked on the one for lesson 3, this is the only one that's been set. If we go to lesson 2 and mark this as complete, then go to lesson 1 and mark that one as complete, we can go back in here and see that the progress array has been updated. And if we toggle this button here, we can see that the value in our progress array also toggles. So to quickly recap, the useState composable that we've used in this lesson lets us create global state that we can use across components so that when these components are created and destroyed, or even if they're in memory the whole time we're using the app, we can share the state across all of these components. But we have one problem. If I refresh this page, we lose all of our state. That's because we're not persisting this state anywhere. That's what we'll cover in the next lesson.